So here they are. These were the original 18 defendants in the Great Sacramento Conspiracy Trial. Actually, some of them would have the charges against them dismissed during the trial, so it would end up being 14 when the jury got the case. But you can see that Caroline Decker is seated there in the front. There were two other women, Nora Conklin and Lorene Norman, who was from Sacramento. And these 18 people were charged with 2 counts, with criminal syndicalism and conspiracy to commit criminal syndicalism. Well, they were prosecuted by the former Sacramento district attorney, which is an interesting story. His name was Neil McAllister, and he was this jowly, blustering guy who liked to give patriotic speeches about the meaning of Americanism. And he actually was voted out of office in November of 1934 by Sacramento voters, who apparently found his anti-communist crusade to be too extreme, and he was replaced with a liberal. But then the state attorney general, a very conservative anti-communist man named Ulysses Webb, decided to use his special extraordinary powers as attorney general to then appoint the defeated district attorney as special state prosecutor in this case, so that even though he was voted out of office, he then continued to prosecute the case. So he was for the prosecution. The defendants also had a very notable lawyer. Their lead lawyer was a man named Leo Gallagher, who was famous throughout the nation at that point as a civil liberties lawyer. And he had been threatened with lynching and beaten up many times for his defense of labor activists and various leftists. And Leo Gallagher also had the distinction of having been kicked out of Nazi Germany for his overzealous defense of the man who was accused of burning down the Reichstag. So he had an international reputation as the defender of underdogs. Leo Gallagher was joined by 5 of the defendants who decided to represent themselves. And so that was part of the reason that the trial lasted so long, is that any witness could theoretically be questioned by 8 different people. And sometimes they were. So the prosecution began the case not by proving that the defendants were communists, because they admitted that, but instead by proving that the Communist Party was a revolutionary organization. So he had the court reporter read into the record Communist Party literature, which was selectively edited and also very dull. So the first 5 weeks of the trial drove away a lot of the journalists who had come to cover it, who then returned when things got spicy again. Then after he had read all of this into the record, then the prosecutor, McAllister, started calling to the witness stand people who could testify to the violent tendencies of the defendants, which meant spies, or as the communists called them, stool pigeons, people who had been paid by business to infiltrate the party. And so the spies would testify about what they had heard at Communist Party meetings. There was a lot of testimony about various sexual perversions of the communists. So that was quite salacious, that were of course all denied by the communists. And then they also called to the stand, the prosecutors called to the stand, vigilantes who had been present when these union organizers gave speeches. And so then the vigilantes would talk about the violent tendencies of the communists on trial. And this infuriated, more than anything, even more than the spies, the defendants. And the most dramatic moment in the trial was when one of the witnesses was accused by the defendants of being one of the men who killed the workers in Pixley. So that Chambers, in representing himself, stood up and shook his finger at the witness and said, "You was one of the fellows that did the shooting." Now, the prosecution thus put on its case, and then it was the defense's turn, and the defense essentially argued that it was a free speech issue, that these people had the right, that they were communists, they all admitted being communists, most of them went on the stand, that they were communists, but that they had a right to be communists, that it was legal in California. And it was their right as Americans, and they kept emphasizing their Americanism, their right as Americans to believe and say what they wanted. They also argued that it was really about labor costs and their crusade to raise the wages of farm workers and thus, eat into the profits of the growers. The summation was delivered by Caroline Decker. She was chosen by the other defendants to give the closing statement to the jury. And she said, and I had to get this from a Communist Party publication actually, because the court reporter in Sacramento recorded everything that the men said, but whenever Caroline Decker talked, he would just write in, Miss Decker went on a rant, and not actually her actual words, which I think is an interesting commentary on silent big women in history. But according to the communist newspaper, she said, if you vote for an acquittal, you are not voting for communism, you are voting for the right of the American people to say what they please. Neil McAllister, whose every word of his 3-hour oration was recorded, then came to a climax when he went to the front of the courtroom, took the flag, unfurled it, waved it around, and then led the entire courtroom in the Pledge of Allegiance. And then he said, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask you to think of that flag in your jury room, and I ask you to think of what it stands for, and I'm going to ask you to bring in a vote for that flag, for the good old USA, for my country 'tis of thee, for the Star-Spangled Banner, for my own United States, and God will bless you. Over the next 3 days, there was a lot of tension in Sacramento. As you can see, people gathered on the courthouse steps, waiting to hear what the verdict would be. Despite McAllister's equation of Americanism and a guilty verdict, it actually took the jury quite a while to come to a decision. They took 66 hours, 118 ballots, and at one point they filed back into the courtroom to ask the judge, isn't the Communist Party legal in California? And why are these people on trial? And he told them essentially, don't worry about it, do your job. So after 3 days, they came back and filed into the courtroom and issued their verdicts. Of the 14 people still on trial, they convicted 8. 6 were acquitted. The 8 who were convicted of 1 count. They were convicted of conspiracy to commit criminal syndicalism, but not criminal syndicalism. Now, this was a somewhat nonsensical verdict, which the state appeals court ultimately ruled. A year and a half later, it released the people who were still in prison and overturned the verdicts because it said it was inconsistent. All 14 people had the same evidence against them, but only 8 were convicted, and also how could you conspire to commit criminal syndicalism and not actually commit criminal syndicalism. So when the verdicts were read, people in the courtroom started to cry, the defendants cried, their lawyers cried, the audience wept, and then even some of the jurors started to weep. And one of the jurors almost immediately recanted and said he hadn't wanted to convict any of them, but he had been pressured to do so. Nevertheless, the judge sentenced those 8 convicted to 5 years in prison. The men went to San Quentin, which was not just death row, but the place for political dissidents at that time. And the women went to Tehachapi State Women's Prison near Bakersfield.